Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are on I think, a really practical mission. We want to move beyond just defining prejudice and bias and dive straight into the psychological strategies, the techniques that are actually proven to work in reducing them.
hmm
We're pulling our insights from the incredible research compiled in the psychology of prejudice and discrimination, and our goal here is to give you a blueprint, something that goes from personal mental exercises all the way up to large-scale institutional change.
That's exactly right. And for a lot of people, the idea of reducing ingrained bias can feel, well, it can feel overwhelming, almost impossible.
Yeah.
But the psychological research really does offer some clear, actionable pathways.
Okay.
So we're going to look at the evidence, what truly moves the needle, what conditions have to be met for interactions to succeed, and also how different organizational philosophies can either help or sometimes unintentionally hurt progress.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I want to start with the most internal, the most personal process. If you listening right now want to reduce your own biases, where does psychology tell us you should even begin?
You start with the brain's own ability to learn and adapt, specifically through something called self-regulation.
Okay.
We're talking about the self-regulation model of prejudice reduction. And it's especially effective for people who genuinely see themselves as fair-minded. People who believe they're unprejudiced.
Which, thankfully, is how most people see themselves, even if they sometimes slip up.
Precisely. And the process, it doesn't really begin when you consciously decide, okay, today I'll be less prejudiced. It begins when you catch yourself behaving in a way that contradicts that internal self-image.
Ah,
So let's say you genuinely believe in equality, but you catch yourself making a snap negative judgment about someone based on, I don't know, how they're dressed. That action creates this awareness of a deep contradiction.
so that internal jolt, that moment of, wait, that wasn't me, is actually the engine of change.
It is. If you acknowledge that contradiction, you experience what researchers call negative affect, guilt, maybe some disappointment, a moment of reflection. That discomfort, it forces you to ask, okay, what caused me to act that way? And how could I behave differently?
And that reflection leads to what you called control cues.
Yes, exactly. Those are the mental flags, the warning signals you set up for the future.
Can you give us an example, like a concrete example of what a control cue might sound like inside your head before the thought even fully forms?
Sure. It might be as simple as recognizing a specific situation. So say you're walking into a meeting where you're the only person of your background. A cue might automatically trigger a mental note. Okay, be mindful of your assumptions right now.
Ah, I see.
That cue then inhibits the knee-jerk prejudice response and lets you substitute a more appropriate non-prejudiced behavior instead.
And the beauty of this whole self-regulation model is that you're not stuck manually hitting those warning flags forever, are you?
Not at all. With consistent practice, that self-regulation becomes automatic. The goal is to move beyond just actively catching yourself to reducing the stereotype activation in the first place.
Right.
And what's really effective, according to the sources, isn't just negating stereotypes, just saying not X, but actively affirming counter-stereotypes.
What do you mean by that?
So instead of just thinking, women aren't bad drivers, you would actively recall or imagine examples of women who are exceptionally skilled drivers, race car drivers, engineers. Practicing these counter-stereotypes has a much larger, more positive effect than just denying the negative one.
You're replacing the faulty mental script, not just crossing it out.
Exactly.
Okay, so moving from those internal scripts to more active mental exercises, let's talk about perspective taking. This is the classic advice, right? Imagine walking in someone else's shoes.
It's classic for a reason. The psychological evidence supporting it is it's robust. Perspective taking means actively forcing yourself to see the world through another person's experiences.
And in studies, they do this by having people write an essay, a day in the life of someone from another group, or maybe listen to an interview about their experiences with discrimination.
Yes. And the effects they're remarkable.
Mhm.
It doesn't just make you feel better. The sources show it measurably changes behavior. Perspective takers develop more positive outgroup attitudes. They show less bias on both explicit and implicit evaluations. And these effects can be surprisingly long-lasting.
So why does it work so well?
The mechanism is pretty powerful. When you do it, you start to realize there's a huge overlap in experiences and characteristics between you and the other person. That strengthens the social bond. You're then more likely to help someone from that group, and you actively want to close that social distance.
But like any psychological tool, this has its limits. It's not a guaranteed fix for everyone.
That's a crucial nuance, yeah. For people who really strongly identify with their in-group, engaging in perspective-taking can sometimes backfire. It can lead to more resentment or defensiveness.
Interesting.
We also see the benefits are more pronounced in societies with high relational mobility.
Can you just quickly define relational mobility for us?
Sure. It just refers to societies where it's relatively easy to switch social groups, make new friends, form new relationships. In those kinds of fluid environments, a good perspective-taking exercise is more likely to be reinforced by, a new positive social connection.
Okay, that makes sense.
And one other thing, if someone anticipates an actual interaction right after doing the exercise, they can get anxious about how they'll come across. And that anxiety can actually reduce the positive effect.
So the mental work is critical, but true. Sustained prejudice reduction often requires genuine positive interaction, which of course brings us to the intergroup contact theory, the contact hypothesis.
Yes.
The famous idea that just putting groups together leads to positive change.
And this is where we have to be really clear. Contact alone is often not enough.
Yeah.
In fact, proximity without the right structure can lead to conflict, or it can just reinforce the stereotypes that are already there. The sources are emphatic on this. Positive change happens only under the proper conditions.
Okay, so let's break down those 4 conditions for successful contact. First up, we need equal status.
Yes. The groups have to have equal status within the contact situation itself. Now, this doesn't mean they have equal status in the wider world, but for that moment, a work project, a sports team, their roles have to be seen as equally important.
Otherwise, the higher status group might just look down on the other, reinforcing the bias.
Precisely. They might derogate the lower status outgroup. Second condition is cooperation. They have to work together toward a common goal.
Yeah, just putting 2 rival departments next to each other in an office doesn't do anything. It usually just makes things worse.
Exactly. Proximity without cooperation. Cooperation forces interdependence. Think about the source's example with sports. Cooperative contact on a team sport drastically improves intergroup attitudes.
Because you have to work together to win.
Right, but contact in an individual sport, like a track team, where everyone just trains for their own event, it has almost no relation to attitude improvement. Contact without a shared goal is just existing near each other.
Okay, condition 3 is acquaintance potential. I'm guessing this is about getting past surface level stuff.
It is. There has to be an opportunity to get to know each other as individuals, not just as, representatives of a group. Ideally, this leads to friendship. And the research here shows intergroup friendships are the single strongest lever for lowering prejudice.
And it's the quality of that friendship that matters, not just the number of hours you spend together.
Quality over quantity, absolutely.
And the final condition, institutional support. Someone in charge has to set the tone.
Absolutely. Authorities, teachers, managers, community leaders, they have to establish and reinforce the expectation for lower prejudice, for positive relations. When they do that, it can create dissonance in people who hold private prejudices.
Meaning their attitudes have to shift to match their new, required, unprejudiced behavior?
Exactly. People naturally adjust their private beliefs to match their public actions.
So when you get all 4 of these conditions right, what's the outcome?
Well, it increases knowledge about the other group, it boosts empathy, and it measurably reduces stereotyping, perceived threat, and what we call intergroup anxiety.
But there are limits here too, right?
There are. Contact may not be as effective for people who are already really high in prejudice or intergroup anxiety. They're the very people most likely to avoid contact in the first place.
And that leads us to a really crucial and frankly a kind of scary concept, the positive-negative contact asymmetry.
This is a critical finding. It's something we really need to absorb. While positive contact is common, and it is effective, when negative contact happens, even if it's brief or if it stirs up strong emotions like anger, its effects are often far more powerful and harmful than the positive effects of lots of good contacts.
Wow. So you're saying 1,000 successful positive interactions could potentially be undone by one really bad one. That raises the stakes for every single encounter.
It absolutely does. It suggests that we have to be mindful of the volatility of these interactions, especially early on.
So if direct, high-quality contact isn't always an option, there's also good evidence for indirect contact methods.
We do, yeah. First, there's extended contact. This is as simple as having a friend in your in-group who has a friend in an out-group.
Really? That's it?
That's it. And it's surprisingly effective, even for people who have almost no opportunity for direct contact themselves. It works by reducing their anxiety and just showing that these kinds of relationships are permissible and they can be positive.
So even seeing positive portrayals of intergroup friendships in media, like a TV show or a movie, that acts as a form of extended contact.
Exactly. And the other method is imagined contact. Basically, mentally rehearsing a positive, relaxed first meeting with an outgroup member.
That sounds a lot like mental prep for a big performance or a presentation.
Psychologically, it is. This rehearsal helps you develop a social script. It reduces the negative emotions, the physiological arousal, the racing heart, and it makes you more likely to engage in perspective taking when the real interaction finally happens.
Okay, now we have to face the big question here, the final hurdle, generalization. So you form a great friendship with one person. How do you make sure that liking generalizes to the entire group they represent?
This is often the trickiest part of the whole process. The sources point to a sort of progression. The first outcome is usually personalization. You see the outgroup member as a unique individual, which is great for liking that person, but it often doesn't generalize to the whole group.
So this is the classic exception problem. I like you, you're one of the good ones, but your group is still. That doesn't solve the bigger problem.
It doesn't. To bridge that gap, you need to move to the salient categorization model. This is where positive attitudes generalize only if the outgroup members are seen as typical of their group and they still disconfirm the negative stereotypes.
That sounds like a cognitive tightrope walk. They have to be representative of their group, but also defy the negative expectations of that group at the same time.
It's a delicate balance. If that person is seen as a total exception, an anomaly, the group stereotype stays fully intact. For the positive feeling to generalize, the person has to be seen as a true representative, which means their positive actions have to be absorbed into your perception of the group as a whole. It takes real mental effort.
And the final goal, the sort of end game, is common in-group identity. Recategorizing everyone into one single shared group.
This is highly effective at reducing prejudice, but
There's a risk.
majority group members might unconsciously assume the new common identity is just defined by their norms, and minority members might worry about having to give up their own valued identities.
So the solution is a dual identity.
Correct. The dual identity lets people keep their current group identity while also taking on that higher-order common identity. This progression personalization to salient categorization, and finally to a common or dual identity, that's often the natural sequence of successful long-term contact.
Let's pivot now from individual psychology to institutional action, specifically diversity ideologies. The philosophy and organization adopts matters hugely, doesn't it?
It's fundamental, and we can quickly dismiss the assimilationist perspective, which says minority groups should just adopt the majority culture. It's highly correlated with prejudice because it's built on a foundation of disrespect.
Okay, so that leaves the two big ones, colorblind and multicultural. The colorblind approach says we should ignore group membership, focus on what we have in common.
The colorblind idea is tricky because it really has two very different faces. On one hand, you have color evasion actively avoiding any talk about race. That
Yeah.
is positively correlated with prejudice. It reduces the motivation to address inequality, and it's strongly linked to microaggressions.
But then there's the other side of that coin, the equality orientation.
Right. And that's the belief that everyone should be treated the same, focusing on fairness and our similarities. This aspect is strongly and negatively correlated with prejudice. It's the healthier side of the colorblind idea.
And then we have the multicultural perspective, that race and ethnicity should be given attention, they should be celebrated, and that prejudice really comes from a lack of knowledge and respect.
Yeah, this approach generally leads to lower prejudice scores, both implicit and explicit. It fosters respect. But it has a major shortcoming. It can strengthen the perceptions of group differences, which, if it's mishandled, can actually be used to justify inequality.
How does it justify inequality?
Well, by focusing so heavily on group differences, it can subtly lead people to attribute different outcomes, like income gaps, to supposed deficiencies within the minority group itself, rather than to systemic barriers or historical issues.
So you're saying focusing too much on difference without also underscoring equality can be misused to just validate the status quo. What's the best approach then?
The sources really suggest a blended approach. You start with multiculturalism to build respect and knowledge, but you have to incorporate equality orientation to highlight our fundamental similarities. You underscore the mutual influences between cultures.
And institutions try to roll these ideas out through things like diversity initiatives. We're talking about programs like affirmative action, which the sources note is really designed to combat discrimination, to ensure a diverse workforce, not necessarily to reduce prejudice directly.
And the findings on its effects on prejudice are definitely mixed. Some studies show in-group members holding negative attitudes toward the beneficiaries, but other research finds that organizations that successfully implement it can foster more positive intergroup attitudes overall, possibly by acting as that institutional support we talked about earlier.
And then there's diversity training, the classic solution.
Its effectiveness is, well, it's hard to nail down because the content varies so much. We do know that mandatory training doesn't always improve attitudes. Sometimes it just generates resentment. And voluntary training, well, it often only attracts the people who are already on board.
The idea of bias literacy training, though, that sounds promising.
It is because it focuses on a capability. It's the ability to accurately detect your own prejudices and others. It moves beyond guilt, and it focuses on practical behavior. For instance, people can be trained on how to confront bias gently by avoiding what's called HATE, hostility, aggressiveness, threat, and extremity.
And instead using softer strategies.
Exactly. Asking genuine questions or just expressing surprise.
We have to close this part by talking about the very real unintended consequences of some of these initiatives, even the most well-meaning ones.
They are significant, and you have to manage them. Initiatives can sometimes signal to the majority group that others are getting an unfair advantage, which leads to resentment, claims of reverse discrimination, or, maybe worse, it can subtly imply that some groups can't succeed without help.
And the training itself can make people anxious or resistant.
It can, especially if they feel pressured to change their fundamental attitudes overnight.
This deep dive has covered a huge spectrum, from automating anti-prejudice scripts in your own mind to the nuances of global policy. What is the single most actionable summary you can offer our listener from all these sources?
I think the biggest takeaway is that change starts internally, but it absolutely requires external practice. Reflect on your own identities, acknowledge those moments of contradiction, that's your self-regulation model right there, then put contact theory into practice. Seek out non-in-group media for extended contact. And when you do have real-world interactions, remember those 4 conditions for success. But most importantly, work on developing that automatic control over stereotypes.
Our deep dive shows that reduction is such a multi-layered process. It demands commitment from individuals, from institutions, from the culture itself. We spent time emphasizing that negative contact can be overwhelmingly more powerful than positive contact, and we know that the quality of friendships matters so much more than the sheer quantity of contact hours. So given that powerful long-term ripple effect of both positive and negative experiences, what daily step can you take today, even if it's just mentally rehearsing a positive meeting through imagined contact, to improve the quality of a single future interaction, knowing how much that one moment might truly matter?